Where did we go wrong? Where did firearms go wrong? When did firearms also become, it's not a tool and it's seen as a threat? When did that start to happen? When we started to have people issues.
Are property rights not inherent human rights, though?
Not here in Canada. Everything in this country is seen as more of a privilege. We had a criminal commit home invasion. Details are thin on what happened. The homeowner gets into an altercation with the criminal who breaks in with a crossbow into his home, and the homeowner, after the altercation, is charged, I believe, with aggravated assault. If people only knew the truth about what happens behind the scenes, we are just, as law enforcement, barely keeping Canadians safe.
Your law enforcement officers, they're out there and they're making these arrests.
They are working their asses off and they're putting their lives at risk every day. This isn't a frontline policing problem. This is from the top down. This is at a federal level. What we're telling our prisons, we're telling our wardens, we need to release these guys, get them out of the prisons.
When an intruder last week busted through that window, breaking into a second-floor apartment, the fight that ensued set off a national debate about self-defense and reasonable force. Court documents say the alleged intruder, Michael Kyle Breen, was out on probation and armed with a crossbow. The tenant, Jeremy David McDonald, allegedly fought back with a knife. Now he faces charges of aggravated assault and assault with a weapon.
Safety recommendations will allow for those that are victimizing members in the community to leave and not harm anyone. The only thing I'd say is, if we are going to rely on our community members to take matters into their own hands to solve this problem, we have all failed our community.
Especially when we face the reality that the majority of illegal guns come into Canada from the US, and I think that there's some skepticism as to whether the minister can address the fact that, well, what he said in private and now he's being held accountable for publicly is the fact that this won't really address crime and public safety.
This next interview is going to be with Rob Furlong. Some of you might know who Rob is already, but I've gotten the chance to spend a couple trips with him up into Canada. Once again, shooting from the top of the Rockies in places that you never really think that you're going to have a chance to shoot in. See, Rob is a hell of a shooter himself. Back in 2002, Rob Furlong set the world record for the longest kill in combat. His shot, which was placed on a guy walking through a wadi, was at 2,430 meters. That record has of course been broken since then. But Rob also has the unique perspective of being a former law enforcement officer. In this interview, Rob and I sat down and talked about Canadian culture, but also Canadian culture from the lens of, once again, a former law enforcement officer. Rob doesn't appear to hold any punches here, and that's because in his mind, at least in my paraphrasing for it, his culture as a Canadian is absolutely eroding. I'm not going to spend too much time here in the intro. Rob Furlong speaks for himself, and it's time to hear him do that. I'd like to welcome to American Marksman our next interview, Mr. Rob Furlong from Rob Furlong's Marksmanship Academy. I needed to come up to Canada to better understand all these news stories that we're hearing about confiscations, potentially bans, how that might impact you as a Canadian, how it impacts Canadian culture. If you wouldn't mind just helping me better understand the current state of things in Canada, specifically with your rights to own a firearm, to own property. That's really what I'm here to understand this time.
So that's kind of where we're different from the States. Like, we don't have gun rights in Canada. Like, you guys have the right to bear arms, much different than what we have here in Canada, where it's a privilege, like a driver's license, right? You do a course. If the vetting process comes back and the government or the government body sees fit that you're eligible for a firearms license, you're granted that privilege. And then it's closely monitored. Firearms owners in Canada are probably some of the heaviest vetted portions of the civilian population. Every 24 hours, CPIC, Canadian Information, or it's like a policing information system. You get ran every 24 hours as a firearms owner. So if you were involved in a domestic the night before, it would show up on the system the next day, and then your firearms license would be nil or void. If criminal charges were laid, you could have firearms conditions placed on you, and the firearms had to be turned in. So yeah, it's not a right here in Canada to own firearms.
What about your rights to own property, though? What is a firearm if it isn't your property?
I mean, you can try and equivalent it to owning a car or a home, or a lawnmower. But in the law, it's not seen like that. And we have, our laws are categorized into certain areas, and the Canadian Firearms Act in the criminal code stands alone as its own act. So, comparing it to other property, it's very defined and outlined, distinguished in the Firearms Act, basically what is a firearm, and then the legislation around that. So that argument there of comparing it to anything else you own is, so to speak, dead in the water.
So I know I get it. You're speaking, to the definition of law, and I happen to know that you do have a law enforcement background, so I know you're going to lean on that, right? But inherently, when any tool can be misused, right? So I'm kind of speaking to a layer lower than that, almost from a foundational perspective, right? I don't personally, this is me obviously exploring your culture and how you guys kind of look at and associate firearms with your culture. But as an American, understanding that we do have different laws, we do have different defined or at least affirmed rights, I don't find that as humans, anybody in the world has different rights than another outside of defined law. So what I'm looking at here is it just law, or is there a culture around firearms that has led to a point to where it's making these bans easier to implement? Is there an erosion of a history that has ultimately led to where we are today?
Well, I mean, obviously. And I think that's in your country as well as mine, and
Absolutely.
And there's been examples of that in UK, Australia. We can go back in history where we've seen mass confiscation of firearms, and a lot of
It hasn't turned out well, by the way.
No, it really has not. Anybody who has any knowledge of history based around confiscation, it doesn't necessarily turn out well. But instead of beating that old drum, because that's, I try to look at this deeper.
Okay.
Because why all of a sudden are we trying to take a tool from people in this country who settled this land with a firearm? We were hunters, we were trappers, we were explorers, we were adventurers, and we settled this country carrying a firearm. That is not up for debate. That's fact. That's in the books. Nobody landed on the shores of Canada without a firearm.
No, nor in the United States. And something that I try and remind people quite a bit is, until that border was drawn, it was essentially the same people that had, populated the East and pushed west in a lot of circumstances.
So let's kind of 10 times the speed. So we land the shores, we have firearms, we settle Canada, we start to become a more modern society, and as part of that, we start to instill laws, and firearms laws eventually get instilled, and we land to where we are today. And I know that's pretty quick to glaze over a little
Yeah,
150 years of
missed
history.
missed a couple key moments there.
What I'm trying to get at is firearms have been a part of Canadian culture since before Canada. Why all of a sudden do we feel Canada is a better version of what it's been in history to now all of a sudden want to pull that tool away from Canadians who have grown up with them? I grew up with a grandfather who had the utmost respect for firearms and taught us at a very young age how firearms are treated and would openly talk to us about that. I had a father who was in law enforcement. Firearms was a big part of our life, and we grew up as firearms in our lives as part of that historic Canadian culture. And we respected them and we understood them, and they were there as a tool for hunting. Yes, maybe a little bit of sport shooting with your odd 22 on the weekends and so forth, but they weren't locked in a 3/4 inch steel safe. They were standing behind the old wood stove.
They were accessible.
They were up on the gun rack. They were overhead in the old homes in the rafters. When you walked into the old folks, and I use that to explain my grandparents' generation, in the old what they would call salt box homes, the rafters were exposed and they would put braces across the top, and that's where your rifles would lay. And to go into somebody's home for Sunday dinner, for Christmas or Easter, or just a visit on Sunday, those firearms were in the open. And it was such an everyday part of our life that they didn't cause any discomfort, any threat. They were just there, and they were no different than having a broomstick in the corner.
What do you think changed, though?
And this is where I'm going. Where did we go wrong? Where did firearms go wrong? When did firearms also become, it's not a tool and it's seen as a threat against a certain percentage of our society? Let's start thinking back. When did that start to happen? When we started to have people issues, not firearms issues. And because we just had this happen, and I'm going to talk about it because it needs to be talked about. We just had a gentleman in the state lose his life in front of his family while talking and using that right that he has for freedom of speech.
You're talking about Charlie Kirk.
I am talking about Charlie Kirk because we need to start talking more about what the real problem is. The problem, and this isn't an old argument, but we never looked at it this way. The problem is not firearms accessibility, firearms capabilities, how they're classified, what's on them, what is the barrel length, what is the energy that they produce. These are all cliche, hot button words that are used by people who just want to invent a fake fear for a tool that's been in our society since Canada's existed, to rid themselves or rid society of a tool that they feel is responsible for either harm or hurt that they've either experienced personally or have seen in the public in the past. I feel for anybody who's lost a loved one, a friend, a husband, a wife, to any sort of violence. I was a police officer. I've spent the majority of my life serving my country or my community at some level. I've seen horrific things. I've seen people go through some very hardship experiences, trauma, extreme violence, loss of life. I do feel for those people. And I've said before, the anti-gun group, I would love nothing more to spend some time with those people, to hear their arguments and hear what their personal beliefs are and stuff, and sit at the table and try to find common ground to understand and appreciate their stance in a real good conversation. But we're looking at the problem from the wrong end. It is not a firearms problem, because what I would explain to anybody on the anti-gun side is, I've seen things that they haven't. And maybe there are people in there who have served in law enforcement and military, but I can attest to this. When a human wants to kill another human, they will use whatever tool is readily accessible to them. That may be a firearm, a rock, a bat, a spear, a car, a brick. It is not the tool. We have a problem in our society with what is normal. Going right back to the Charlie Kirk incident that we just had. Desensitization of violence for younger generations is changing our culture. Why do we have 14-year-olds and 16-year-olds in Ontario with guns shooting other people? My grandfather didn't grow up with 14 and 15-year-olds shooting each other.
Do you think it's an issue in the home? That, or at least that starts in the home, that starts in how you are raised?
Okay, let's visit that, because maybe that's a valid argument. And I think that, violence in the home, maybe that's an issue. Maybe
Well, I'm looking at it more from an attentiveness perspective, right? So, yeah, growing up, it took me until I was an adult to have a really great father figure, right? But I eventually did have someone to impart some level of values on me, at least those values that are applicable to my culture, right? Cultures and their values are built, where you stand is where you sit, right? So where I'm looking at it is.
So could we circle back and say, certain children may be subjected to hardship in a home that may cause them to be more susceptible to a violent act because of how they've been treated in a home? Would that kind of summarize what that concern would be? Because
Yes and no. So that's I think a part of kind of where I'm taking this. And the other part of it, you have kids, right?
3.
You have 3 children, boys, girls?
All boys.
All boys. The attention that you provide your boys, teaching them to be young men, that is something that not everybody is afforded. And I can tell you that from personal experience. And I can tell you that those people that I grew up with the same issue, not all of them were able to make it out of the trailer park, if that kind of makes sense. So from my perspective, I'm looking at it more, do we have a disconnect with parents now where there isn't the same attentive relationship, I wouldn't say disciplinary, but this instillment of human value from parents in certain households?
We can give weight to so many different things on the failures of society, we'll say. And one of them being, the parenting. I think there is suffering definitely in our cultures, and I'll say North America. I'll only speak to North America because that's kind of where we live. You'd be hard pressed to try and convince me now that children are worse off now than they were in the 20s and 30s. Poverty was rampant. Capital punishment type of, raising your children was rampant. I mean, if you go back, let's go back one generation. Were they spanked? Were they hit with a meter stick at school? Were, those type of things. Kids are not subjected to that type of abuse now. But why are our children more violent now than they've ever been in the past? I don't necessarily blame the parents. Are there shitty parents? We could stack them miles high. There is a lot of horrible parents out there. But do you think the parents of the guy who just killed Charlie Kirk were horrible people?
I don't know much about
We don't
that,
know, right? But I'm willing to bet if we went out, they probably did their absolute best to raise a child. I mean, I'm only going off of what I'm getting third-hand information through media that is sometimes a little bit hard to trust.
We're actually still, I mean, everybody understands at this point we're filming a documentary here, right?
Yeah.
So we're actually very, very few days past that happening, to be frank. So there's relatively little information. We've been living in a field for the past 4 days, to be honest with you.
So what causes these young people to resort to such a level of violence? It's their exposure to violence. You're a soldier. What happens to soldiers the first time they are introduced into combat? They freeze. They're not used to that smell, that sight. It's a sensory overload. You freeze, you take a moment, you collect yourself, you're not used to being shot at. You're not used to seeing certain things. And then after a while, it doesn't really bother you. And you go back into the next firefight. You go back into the next, I'm referring to law enforcement. You go into the next suicide. You go into the next hanging. You go into the next whatever. Soldiers and first responders are subjected to desensitization events throughout their whole career. This isn't new. There's all kinds of public speakers out there who speak about this all the time. But we're adults. Why are now young children being exposed to assassinations, executions, and watching this on TV? We are doing a lot of this ourselves, and we fight. The same people who are fighting to take firearms off the streets are the same people who are okay with us subjecting our children to things they should not be subjected to. But yet, if I'm against that, I can be quietly summed up because, well, it's technology. They should be reading about that in school. I'm not just necessarily talking about what happened a few days ago. It could be anything.
I'm in agreement with you that there's a normalization to violence. I'm intimately familiar with that, being my work with Funker 530. It's something we try and combat every day. But I would turn this back to you, right? So you talk about why are our kids exposed to that? My question to you is, where are they being exposed to that right now? Everywhere we look.
Absolutely. Let me ask you, not just you, our listeners, when you're on the phone and your kids are in the back seat, do you sometimes say things? Do you sometimes watch the news with the kids in the background? I can tell you this, when I was a child, I was curious, I was mischievous and stuff. I listened to my parents talk. I watched the news when they were watching the news. I took it all in, and there wasn't a lot of access to that stuff back then. Now it's everywhere. Not only is it everywhere, now I have, a 7-year-old and a 10-year-old who have access to smart devices. And when somebody looks at you and goes, well, your kid shouldn't have access to smart device, I'm like, you're one of two things. You're stupid or you don't have kids. Anybody who has kids, the kids eventually are going to get access to some smart device, whether it's not supposed to be accessible to them and it's just laying on the countertop, or they do have an iPad or a phone. When you select, say, YouTube, and there's a hot video that's trending, whether it's, it could be the flavor today, it's not yet met that algorithm where it's going to be blocked. It's just like we had a few days ago.
Sure.
It was everywhere. And then now our kids are watching that. Or they're watching the videos of Ukraine and Russia and what's going on. What I'm trying to get at here is it is at their fingertips. And I think that what's happening is the desensitization of our children for violent acts is playing out in front of us. And instead of wanting to deal with that very complex issue, we look at them, well, what's the lowest hanging fruit? Let's just get rid of the firearms. And I can tell you, and please timestamp this, because we are going to lose our firearms here in Canada. It's just a matter of time. Violence in this country is not going to stop. It will never stop. And the type of violence that we're seeing in this country and how it's carried out by some of the gang members utilizing firearms that haven't been accessible in this country, period. You got guys in British Columbia shooting up a driveway with a Scorpion. You can't buy a Scorpion in Canada. You've never been able to buy a Scorpion.
It's not even available up here.
No, it's never been available. It's a pro-hib firearm. That didn't get stolen out of somebody's garage. Grandpa didn't leave that in the backseat of his truck when he was at the grocery store. Those clowns are bringing it in from other countries, probably the United States. It's getting smuggled in. It's not coming from Canada. Until Canada wants to grow up and start to really face the real issues, and not just the children desensitization thing. That's just a very grassroots thing that we need to work on as a society. Just the real problems, like organized crime.
Sure. Yeah, you're
like
attacking
drug
this at
dealers.
multiple angles.
It has to be dealt with all leaders, but they don't want to deal with it.
Because these issues are complex, you're right. This is kind of we've dealt with our share, I wouldn't say the same amount that Canada has, of firearms conversations in the United States. And these issues that are a part of the underlying problem are complex. And you'll get the question from people say, well, what would you do? And it's a softball of a question, just like we just got into, right? Is yes, there's an element of it. We need to take a look at our youth, in my opinion, right? We need to take a look at how exactly they are being exposed to a lot of this stuff that does desensitize them to it, to the point to where they're driving down the road and there's a family with a car on fire and you mentioned this earlier, they see it, I'm late to Dunkin' Donuts, I'm just going to keep on driving by. There is the element of criminals are going to break the law, right? So these firearms that you've already banned are the things that they're still using anyway. These are things that are prohibited, and they're not. If I intend to already do something illegal, right, and you tell me I can't do some other thing that's illegal, that's not going to resonate very much with me, is it?
No. And it's funny because, see the forest for the trees is kind of what I'm trying to get at. The people who are trying to convince you that we need to remove firearms from Canadian society to make Canada safer are the same people who would fight you as a police officer about their rights, their freedoms. You can't go after drug dealers. You can't do target vehicle stops at night, even though I know that guy is a shithead And I know that that's a drug dealing vehicle because I've had X amount of years of law enforcement experience and dealing with drugs and gangs and stuff. And I know that that guy right there is a known drug dealer, but yet you've pigeonholed law enforcement so bad and crucified them that they don't even want to do their job anymore. Those are the same people who don't want you to have guns. I don't get it.
Does it feel like there's some, I wouldn't say protection, but some preference over a criminal to, essentially you, a law-abiding Canadian citizen?
There's 100%. We're law-abiding citizens. I follow the rules. I put my seatbelt on in the morning. I follow the speed limit. I pay my tax. I live by the laws that I've been raised with. Mm-hmm. We serve our country. We help others. We are the proportion of society that are living by the rules. We aren't using our firearms for ill will purposes. We are law-abiding citizens using them for either hunting, sport shooting, competition, or even just collecting, because there's a love of that portion of society. It's absolutely astonishing to me that they will not put the effort and the funding into focusing on the real issues in this country. Put our criminals in prison and leave them there. If I was Prime Minister, which I would never want that job, but if I was Prime Minister for a certain period of time, one of the things I'd do is I would build a prison as far north as humans are capable of building a prison with no locks. And you could stay up there as long as you want.
You want to leave, you go ahead.
You can leave if you want to leave.
Sure.
But when you commit a crime in this country, the crime and the punishment should line up. We have criminals in this country, I personally see them, this is not third-hand information, with 50 and 60 criminal charges. I'm not talking about scratching cars and stealing stop signs. I'm talking about assaults, drug dealing, possession of a weapon, manslaughter. And these people are out still committing crime. And yet the same people who want to confiscate the guns from the law-abiding citizens who get their name ran every 24 hours just to have not a right, a privilege to own a firearm, are not subjected to that same vetting of criminals. Why is that? Why don't we have a task force out catching sex offenders and drug dealers and organized crime members when they're breaching their conditions?
Do you have a major organized crime problem in Canada?
Huge. Absolutely massive
And you
in
can
Canada.
say that with authority as a
Yeah,
former
because
law
I worked in
enforcement
those
officer.
units.
Sure.
Being told that your investigation is too big, it'll be too expensive to push that through court. We're going to have to break down this investigation because it's too big to run. You imagine that as a police officer?
What does too big to run
You
mean?
get to the court system and it's too big to run. So what does that tell you? Well, if you're going to do crime, do it big. We're not focused on crime in Canada. If people only knew the truth about what happens behind the scenes, we are just, as law enforcement, barely keeping Canadians safe. And I think if there's a chief of police anywhere in Canada worth his uniform, worth his word, would tell you the same thing right now, that we are just barely holding back.
And your officers, your law enforcement officers, they're out there and they're making these arrests, right? They're bringing
They are
people
working
in.
their asses off and they're putting their lives at risk every day even more so now than we've ever had in history. This isn't a frontline policing problem. This is from the top down. This is at a federal level. What we're telling our prisons, we're telling our wardens, we need to release these guys, get them out of the prisons. Now, whether that's a bleeding hearts thing or whether that is a penny pinching, money saving effort, I don't know. But that message is getting passed down to our wardens. Why is that? Why would we want to release high-risk offenders? And please, I would love for somebody watching this to come back and say that's not happening, because I would quickly refresh their memory of a man who was out on violent offenses in Hinton, Alberta a few years back, and after the husband leaves the room in the condo building, the adjacent room opens up, a convicted criminal goes across the hallway and murders his wife and child. That parole officer didn't even know where that guy was. They did not have an active address for that. So I don't accept we're doing this for your safety. We're doing this to create a safer society. We're doing this to take firearms out of the hands of children who are shooting each other on the streets of Ontario. I don't buy that, because I've been there and I've seen it, and it does not work. You can take all the firearms, you can take all the 12 gauges and 30-30s and 30-06 off the streets. It's not going to make any difference because they're not committing the crimes. They prohibited firearms during the OIC of a firearm capable of producing over 10,000 joules.
What's an OIC?
Order in Council.
Okay.
Right? It's where the government pushes a law through.
Okay.
Right? Usually it's a hot topic type of thing, but this was an order in council. It got pushed through. The 50 was caught up in that, the 50 cal rifle. Saying that the 50 cal bolt action rifle will be at high risk for the civilian population is comical, because you're talking about a system that weighs about 27 to 50 pounds, depending on what it is. No criminal is going to be running around with a 50 cal.
They're not just going to stuff that in their pants and...
Yeah. Like, banning that, why? Sure. What was the purpose of it? And I mean, I'm just using the 50 as one of these examples. They tried to paint it all under semi-autos and black guns and all that type of stuff. But it seemed to me that somebody just got it in their head to just carte blanche ban a bunch of guns that they thought were scary.
Do you think that they are consulting the right kind of people on, or I'm certain what your answer is going to be, but I'd still love to hear it, that they are consulting people based on their expertise for, you know, when they are looking at some of these firearms from a logic perspective, right? So you talked about the 50, but there have been other bans that are even more illogical than that.
So you only do consultations when you are trying to make the best effort to make a decision to help the majority, we'll say. Sure. The decision to move forward with these bans were already made. The consultations happened after, and there was zero consultations. And I challenge this because zero consultations made with anybody to any level of understanding of firearms, firearms manufacturing, firearms capabilities, anything. Because when they banned it, Black Rifle Coffee was on the list when it initially came out. Could that be a mistake? Could have that been a cut and paste? Maybe. And I'm not saying mistakes, but what it tells me is they didn't talk to a professional, and they didn't talk to the industry. They didn't talk to end users. They talked to the people who just want to see firearms banned. And that's all this has been from the very beginning, is we are listening to the small minority. Put this to a vote for Canadians. Does Canadians put a price tag on it? If this is going to cost us $1.5 billion, put that out there. Is this the best use of our money? Or could we give this to a task force to focus on production of fentanyl, to organized crime, to child pornography, all three of which are issues in Canada? Anybody in the policing community would tell you, and many more. They could definitely use $1.5 billion. But I think collecting your grandfather's break action 12 gauge is not going to do anything. And somebody's going to say, well, they're not looking for your break action 12 gauge, is an example. But you take one, it eventually happened. This is smoke and mirrors. That's all this is.
So speaking of those consultations earlier, you mentioned that you would love to sit down and have a conversation. Has anybody, you're a pretty well-known Canadian. I'm an American, and I know who you are. Has anybody ever approached you to have a conversation politically? You know, what are your thoughts on this, Rob? Here's what's coming down, especially potentially from, and I don't have a great handle of your political parties, right? I understand that to be a little bit more complicated than what we have in the United States. But I'm assuming there are a body of parties, or at least a party that is really pressing this upon you. Has anybody reached out from that party to say, let's have a conversation?
No, and they won't.
Why?
Well, if they're not talking to the law enforcement community, why are they going to talk to Rob Furlong?
I don't know.
They're not talking to anybody. They're talking to anti-gun groups. Anti-gun groups now are in our politics. We have a representative from Polytechnique connected to Polytechnique, which is an anti-gun group, that is now in our federal politics. In business, we call that a conflict of interest. So I'm not going to tell anybody who should run for politics and who shouldn't. That's one of the beautiful things about living in a free country. But you operate under the same freedoms that the rest of us do. We can have our opinions, and our opinions matter. I'll respect your opinion, you respect mine, and we'll find common ground within there. But there's no consultations happening. Nobody's asking any questions. The order in council was pushed through because they knew there would be resistance.
So there's a term for that, and it's called confirmation bias, right? So if those that have pushed this OIC, I think, correct? If those that have pushed this OIC through have really only consulted or spoken with or are associated with these anti-gun groups, but aren't communicating or consulting with, you know, those that have an immense knowledge of firearms, both from a military, law enforcement, and a civilian capacity, right? You hunt, your parents presumably own firearms there, your grandparents presumably. So that would essentially mean that they are only getting their information from half of the coin. And in order to make an informed decision, you should presumably have...
They will say, yes, we've spoken to the other side. We've spoken to the CCFR. We've spoken to the NFA or the CSAAA, which are all pro-firearms ownership organizations within Canada. We've spoken to all of them. What have we taken away from that? What effort's been put forward to take their position on firearms confiscation? What have we done to take that in consideration and maybe change some of the classifications, look at what's being confiscated, what's not? No. And firearms companies are failing. People are going out of business.
We've spoken with a couple.
100%. There is very little, if any, compassion towards any of the firearms owners or business owners that have been affected by this. Small businesses, which are the backbone of this country. And nobody has any concern of anything they're going through.
Why do you think that is?
Because they don't care.
How could they not care about their countrymen, right? So as an American, there's a, proud to be an American. Is there a similar feeling among Canadians? I mean, culturally speaking, is really what I'm asking for here.
Yeah. Canada's very, very broken and very fragmented right now, and I think even more so now than ever. COVID definitely accelerated that, but it was even there before. You're going to talk to some Canadians who feel like, yeah, nobody should own any firearm of any sort. Okay, that's an opinion, and I can appreciate your opinion. I can respect that because everybody's free to have their opinion. Explain that to me. But we also have people feel that firearms ownership should be a right to bear arms, much like the U.S. Well, we're not the United States, and we're never going to have that type of right here in Canada. We have to be somewhere in between, and we are. We have great laws here in Canada. We enjoy some really, prior to the OIC, some really good, somewhat organized and thought out firearms laws. I didn't have a big problem. People really push back on, guns shouldn't be registered. And you should be like, you know what, if I got to register and get a card and stuff, I don't really care about that. People were all bent out of shape saying, well, I want to hunt with my AR-15. I'm like, well, I don't know. It's not my rifle of choice to go hunting with, but, I can't say I was overly bent out of shape. And I was always fairly quiet on the whole firearms ownership and gun rights and stuff thing right up until the OIC, because it's an overreach on even, and we said we don't have rights, but even an overreach on that privilege to own property in Canada. And I think it's a slippery slope. I think that...
You say privilege to own property?
And that's exactly what it is. It's a privilege in Canada given to you by the government for you to spend your money to purchase a piece of property that which they control. And that's where we are right now. Because if I own a firearm that's currently affected under the OIC and is now classified as prohibited, that's in my safe at home.
Are property rights not inherent human rights, though?
Not here in Canada. No. You guys have very, very different laws. And I know where you're going there. And you guys have things as, stand your ground. You have castle law. You have a lot of laws in the United States to protect property, because you have that right. Everything in this country is seen as more of a privilege and not necessarily a right. Let's take, for example, 3 weeks ago, don't test me on that timeline, it may have been 4 weeks, we had a criminal break and enter, commit home invasion, which is two different things. You can break and enter to an empty dwelling, but you can't break and enter to a dwelling with people in there. So if the homeowner's in there, then it's a home invasion. Then there's possession of a weapon, right? So now it's possession of a weapon with intent. So he breaks into a home with a crossbow. Details are thin on what happened, but the homeowner gets into an altercation with the criminal who breaks in with a crossbow into his home, and the homeowner, after the altercation, is charged, I believe, don't quote me on this, I believe with aggravated assault.
Court documents say the alleged intruder, Michael Kyle Breen, was out on probation and armed with a crossbow. The tenant, Jeremy David McDonald, allegedly fought back with a knife. Now he faces charges of aggravated assault and assault with a weapon.
So we have assault, which would be kind of like common assault, like a fist fight. Assault caused bodily harm, aggravated assault. So it's a high level of assault, meaning there's going to be permanent disfigurement. So, I don't know what happened. I don't know what the extent of the injuries were, But long story short, man is home with his family. To my understanding, there's a wife present and children, to my understanding. The criminal is taken to hospital for injuries, and the homeowner is charged. Think about that for a second. Let's go back to you want to remove a tool from my home that could have been used to maybe defend myself. What is wrong with that? And in Canada, under Section 25 sub 1 of the criminal code, that gets around that kind of use of force. And it's the same section of criminal code that law enforcement would use. It doesn't distinguish in the, well, subsection distinguish, but you can meet force with reasonable force. If you kick in my door and I meet you at the door and you're stumbling drunk and you're lost and disorientated and stuff, I can't beat you with a baseball bat. That you're not meeting force with force. If you're drunk, you kick the door in and you attack me and begin to strike me, I can meet force with force. That didn't happen in this incident, because my personal opinion is when that criminal broke into that home with a weapon, knowledge, consent, and intent to form a criminal charge. He had possession of a weapon. He knew what he was doing was a crime. You can't say that, well, I didn't know kicking in somebody's door and breaking in their home was against the law.
Yeah, whoops.
Now, let's talk about the last. What was your intent? In the military, if you were presented with a life or death situation, how much time do you take to process that?
As little as possible.
As little as possible. And what do you treat the threat as?
A threat?
The highest level of threat, and then you work down. We're soldiers, law enforcement. We have immense amount of training, and we've been lucky to serve in those communities to help us process threats. Sure. You think of a man that's woken up out of his bed next to his wife, maybe with a child in a crib, or a child sleeping in the adjacent room, and the door blows off the hinges. He goes out, there's a guy with a crossbow. Never spent a day in the military or law enforcement. Maybe he's an oil gas worker. How many of those did you meet this weekend? What is their capability to process the threat? It's going to be low. They don't have anything to fall back on.
I put myself in that situation, and personally not even...
Oh, we know what we're going to do.
Well,
but I'm trying to put myself in the situation somebody has no
that's
training.
what I mean is...
Fight or flight.
Sure.
He chose fight. This isn't Rob Furlong's opinion. There's been studies on this. Like, we can go back to Colonel Grossman here. Like, I mean, there's...
Are we going to UDA with this?
Yeah.
Sure.
So that guy chose fight, which is instinctually a human reaction to preserve not only him, but his family. I am not asking a guy, why did you bring a crossbow into my house? Can we talk about this? Like, what is your intention? Because what I'm thinking is he's sticking that through my chest. Now I'm incapacitated, bleeding out and dying, while he's going to rape and kill my family.
Absolutely.
Never, ever, any man worth his weight would put himself in that position. Fight. And you protect your family. And our justice system is failing those people right now. Because if you were telling criminals in this country that you are free to break into homes and terrorize Canadian citizens, all I have to say is courts are going to get much, much busier if this continues to be a trend in the criminal community, because people have had enough in this country. They're going to start to push back. And if you push somebody's door in, there's a high probability you're going to be met with the type of violence that that criminal was met with. And you're going to go to hospital, either on a trolley or in a bag. But nobody is willing to talk to you once you kick a door in with a weapon to see what your intentions are.
Well, having the expectation, you know, military or otherwise, sometimes I get up in the morning, I don't even know where I am. I'm so tired still. 5 a.m. Had some early mornings here. In that circumstance, because I think I am partially familiar with that case in the little bit of research we had the time to do to come up here. I think that homeowner, again, don't quote me on this one because, you know, I had just heard about this a couple weeks ago, ended up having to fight that attacker off with a knife, is what I understand. The tool that the homeowner was able to use, were he to have even had a firearm to potentially meet a crossbow, which, if you want to talk about force continuum, right? In order for me to defeat that, I am going to need something that can defeat the force that's presented against me. Were he to have a firearm in that circumstance, some of your storage laws, I understand those to be pretty strict as well.
Yeah, I mean, let's be honest. I mean, if you were to follow, let's say it was a pistol.
Sure.
Well, right now,
Prohibited.
firearms are prohibited, and they have dual lock storage laws. So your firearm is going to be separated from your ammunition. Your pistol is going to be locked in its safe, or it's a large safe locked to the floor. So to get to a firearm, to get to a pistol, unless you're quick and you're practicing this on a daily basis, and your safe is next to your bed, it's going to be pretty. It's going to be pretty challenging to untrained people. Now, there's other weapon systems that you could have readily accessible to fall within any criminal code laws of Canada that you can use to protect yourself. But I mean, that guy, let's say if he used a knife, I think that he was at more of a threat than a criminal. Like, as a police officer, if you came at me with a knife, we gave you 9 feet.
Sure.
So this is the training that we receive with Edmonton Police Service. Once you reach that 9-foot threshold, and every 9 feet is going to look a little bit different from me, it's going to look a little bit different from you, but everybody knows that that is the distance that during the training that we had, somebody can cover with a knife before you can unholster your gun and get a shot off, and they can slash you, whether that's on your artery or stabbed or wherever. That's what I know as a professional. Civilians are not aware of that information.
Talking about like the tool or drill, and
Once somebody gets within inside of 9 feet with a knife, if their intention is to kill you, you're probably going to die. And that's the long and short of it. Your standoff is your defense, assailant with a knife. Now, let's get rid of the knife, because it wasn't a knife. The good guy had a knife here. The bad guy had a crossbow.
right. So that's what I was saying.
So
is,
now we meet force with force, because he has the same rights under the criminal code as I did as a police officer. If there's a use of form, gross bodily harm or death is the very far extreme end of the use of force. That's where gross bodily harm or death, as a police officer, you access your firearm, you are at the high ready, finger on the trigger. There is a threat against life. That is a threat against life. That's gross bodily harm or death with a crossbow. That meets that criteria. So if this gentleman who had his home broken into and defended himself with a knife, when met with a crossbow, he falls well within the use of force curriculum, even by law enforcement. Of course he stabbed him, if that's in fact what happened, because he was met with an equal or higher level of force. So if bad guy is stabbed, I don't see why that is a criminal charge.
Right. Right. That's kind of my point is...
Now, in the same breath, as a police officer, if I had shot somebody, and I know members who have shot criminals, you are chartered and cautioned. You're not handcuffed, but you're chartered and cautioned. Your firearm is taken from you, and you are going to get a statement taken from you. Now, as law enforcement, you get a period of time. You get to talk to counsel before you give your statement. But I'm wondering, were all those things afforded to the gentleman who had his home broken into?
I don't know.
We don't know. But these are some of the things, as a society, we really need to have some deep discussion on. What are our rights? Okay, I don't have castle law, but I do have the right to protect myself and my family against gross bodily harm or death. How do I do that? If I have that right, and it is a right in Canada, because it's in the Criminal Code of Canada, how do I do that? It is not written in there. What do I have as a tool to defend myself and my family? And that's some of the discussions that I want to have with the other side. And just a normal coffee, sitting down, tell me your side, and I will tell you mine, and let's find some common ground.
You see, it appears as though when you talk about that, so you talk about just to walk the dog all the way to where we are here, right? So we talked about how, criminals are going to be criminals, right? They're going to bring the tools that they have, going back to UDA, right? They've already made their decision to act. They're going to bring the tools that allow them to act in the best capability that they can. And in a lot of instances, or at least in some instances, it's going to involve a weapon in a situation like this. But it seems as though the consideration to the law-abiding, gun-owning citizen, the consideration hasn't been given to you to meet that force with the commensurate force necessary to preserve your life, your family's life, your way of life. And I still don't truly understand how there are certain things that are, banned, but you can have them in these safes. So you technically have it, but you can't take it out at any point unless you're going to a range sometimes. And this, where I'm taking us with this is, what if it's a prohibited firearm, right? So I'm not asking even from a law perspective, almost just from a Canadian citizen perspective. If it's a prohibited firearm, what's your mindset? If somebody kicks your door in and you see in their hand that they've got a crossbow, we'll use the crossbow. What goes through your mind? Is it, oh, let me make sure I grab the one that's non-prohibited for me to use?
Well, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
And I'll try to answer it from a Canadian citizen, as a firearms owner, but also as an ex-law enforcement member.
Great.
As a Canadian citizen who is a licensed, law-abiding firearm owner, your firearms are locked up.
Sure.
I don't think there's many husbands out there with permission from their wife to have a large Liberty safe stationed in the bedroom.
It's great.
I'm going to toss it. I'm going to toss it out there.
It's great interior decorating, as far as I'm concerned.
Is there? Remember the movie Tremors, where they had the big arsenal on the base? Is there that couple? Maybe. For the mass majority, I'm going to say firearms are locked in larger safes at home. So, anything from a 12 to a 60 gun type of large Liberty safe cabinet. That's going to be in a basement. That's going to be in a garage. When somebody kicks in your door, most likely during a home invasion, they want to get in and either neutralize or incapacitate in some way the homeowners, right? To risk a 911 call and stuff. So they'll fan out, right? If it's a group. And this is if it's a random. If it's a planned home invasion, they already know the outlay or the outline of your home. They'll probably know where the bedrooms are. They're going to be in your room probably within 3 to 4 seconds on a single story. On a 2-story, it might take them an extra second or two. Your typical firearms owner, law-abiding citizen, is not going to be able to access a firearm that quickly. So, as a investigator, if I go to a home invasion where the criminal has been shot, I'm first going to, do my investigation. I'm going to look at the scene. We're going to want to talk to the homeowner. And then, of course, I'm going to be questioning in my mind the timeline here to where bad guy breaks in, makes his way to where the confrontation happened. How was the firearm, accessed? Where was the ammunition stuff? You're going to put 2 and 2 together. And then you're going to have to get to this really shitty part of an investigation where, fuck, it was probably in his nightstand. Right?
Sure.
Which, personally, at that point, it would be very difficult to lay the charge. But that's probably the position you would put yourself in as an investigator. Are charges warranted? I mean, you can always talk to the inspector on duty. You can talk to the Crown and see what. But why do we even have to consider that? If the person hasn't had a criminal history, if the person is a licensed firearms owner, there was no threat to the public, the firearm is only accessed and used in a gross bodily harm or death situation, much like what we use in the police force, why are we digging to punish somebody who simply used a tool to defend himself and his family? But yet we're in a situation now where, just like we spoke about, the guy or the gentleman who apparently, or what you heard, might have stabbed this criminal is charged. Because I think what's happening in policing, they're like, you know what? I don't want to deal with not laying the charge because I might get in trouble because I use my discretion. And as a police officer, we're having less and less opportunities, if any, to use our discretion. I'm just going to charge them and the Crown can sort it out. They'll sort it out in court. Let them deal with it. Let the judge deal with it. Okay, I can appreciate that. And I can see that, and I've experienced that. Why do we have to do that? Why do we have to put an innocent person through such hardship? Forget what happened. Forget this whole thing where, let's just speak hypothetically. That I go home tomorrow night and I'm put in the exact same situation and I'm forced to kill somebody who comes into my house with a firearm. Why do I have to be charged? Why do I have to go down and get fingerprinted? Why do I have to get housed? Why do I maybe have to sit in cells overnight with another criminal?
Is it a mandatory charge?
Well, it would be, 100%. I mean, we even charter and caution our police officers after they shoot somebody and they go through an investigation. But why do I have to go down to... if there's going to be a charge, if the investigation shows that the shooting was just that, it was a gross bodily harm and death, why are we putting these people through such hardship? I don't agree with that portion. And I'm sure that somebody in the policing community is going to say, well, it's a process and we had to go through it and it's our laws. I think we're at a point in time where we need to refresh our laws. And we need more rights, not privileges. We need more rights as Canadian citizens, not less. And the firearms topic, as hot of a topic as it is, needs to be a little bit more transparent than what it's been over the last decade.
So where do we go from here?
I hate saying I don't know.
Yeah.
But we've had a change in leadership of our current sitting government. I'm really hoping that with that change of leadership, that there is a willingness to maybe now sit and listen and maybe just reassess the whole OIC. Does that truly benefit the majority of Canadians? And have that discussion. There are some good things that are changing with the current government. There's some things that are still agitating Canadians. A lot of Canadians are still upset about things that have happened in the past decade. We can't change the past, but we can change things moving forward. And I don't want to find us in a position where we're fighting one another. There's got to be a way that we can sit down and find common ground. And I think having those open, transparent discussions need to happen. Stop the closed door, private meetings, and not only a discussion, maybe it's even a vote. Who wants this? Who wants to spend this large amount of money on this initiative by a very small minority of Canadians?
Okay. Well, some of the things that we're going to talk about soon and that I'm excited to do, as you mentioned, a couple gun rights groups that you guys have, or excuse me, a couple folks that pay very close attention to your ability to own a firearm, CCFR. Is there any specific question, or maybe if you'd consider coming along with me for that, to have a conversation with them, I think it'd be a lot of help.
You bet. I'm always interested in having discussions with all sides.
Hell yeah. Let's do that. All right. Thanks, Rob.
Hey, thanks, man.